The digital clock on the wall read 4:17 in the afternoon when the internal messaging system chimed. A summons to the main conference room on a Friday afternoon was never a promotion. At 46 years old, with 21 years of service at Ascent Systems, Daniel knew the rhythm of corporate execution better than the executives who orchestrated them. He locked his workstation, leaving the Federal Compliance Gateway terminal actively churning through the quarterly audits. It was a tedious process, one he had built from the ground up over 2 decades. The glass walls of the conference room were frosted, a recent addition that spoke of secrets rather than transparency. Daniel pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. 3 people waited for him. Chief Executive Officer Bradley Stone sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture radiating a forced casualness. To Bradley's right sat Julian, the Chief Financial Officer, whose eyes were fixed intently on a tablet screen. To Bradley's left was Brenda from Human Resources, her hands folded over a manila folder, her expression carefully neutral, the standard mask of corporate termination. He did not speak. In negotiations, silence was a vacuum that the inexperienced inevitably rushed to fill. Bradley cracked first. He slid a rectangular piece of paper across the polished wood. It came to rest exactly 2 inches from Daniel's fingertips. It was a check for $11,000. 3 weeks of severance. "Daniel," Bradley began, his tone dripping with rehearsed regret. "Ascent Systems is pivoting. We are restructuring our digital infrastructure to align with agile market demands. Unfortunately, that means we are streamlining our senior network architecture roles. Today is your last day." Daniel looked at the check. $11,000 for 21 years of flawless uptime, for nights spent diagnosing routing loops while Bradley slept in his corner office. Brenda opened her manila folder and extracted a single sheet of paper covered in dense legal jargon. She pushed it toward him alongside a heavy blue pen. "We need you to sign this standard release form, Daniel. It outlines the terms of your departure and releases the company from any future claims. Bradley needs this finalized by 5 o'clock today so we can process the severance and close the payroll cycle." Daniel did not pick up the pen. He let his gaze drift from the contract to Brenda, then to Julian, and finally to Bradley. He felt a cold, hard clarity settle over him. The panic they expected, the desperate bargaining, the anger, none of it surfaced. Instead, the analytical mind that had maintained the Ascent network kicked into high gear. By demanding a signature by 5 o'clock on a Friday, they were violating federal statutes designed to protect employees over 40. The law guaranteed him 21 days to review any severance agreement. They were rushing him, hoping the shock of the ambush would override his common sense. "You are asking for a signature in 43 minutes, Daniel stated, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "For a document that legally requires a 21-day review period under federal employment law for employees over the age of 40. This ambush tactic is legally unenforceable, Bradley." Julian finally looked up from his tablet, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his sharp features. "We are offering a generous transition package, Daniel. It is standard procedure. Refusing to sign complicates things unnecessarily for everyone. Standard procedure does not supersede federal law," Daniel replied, leaning back in his chair. "I will not sign your release form. The terms are unacceptable, and the timeline is illegal." Bradley bristled, his forced casualness evaporating, replaced by the arrogant frustration of a man used to getting his way. "If you do not sign that form by 5 o'clock, we will rescind the severance offer. You will walk out of here with nothing but your final paycheck. Do not play games, Daniel. You do not have the leverage you think you do." Daniel allowed a small, tight smile to touch his lips. It was a smile born of deep, technical understanding. They thought leverage was about lawyers and money. They did not realize leverage was about the delicate interlocking dependencies of the network they relied upon every second of every day. "I am not playing games, Bradley," Daniel said softly, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table. "I am simply protecting my rights. Since you are terminating my employment effectively immediately, I will write my own conditional resignation letter to document this interaction and the illegal constraints you have attempted to impose upon me." He stood up, leaving the pen and the contract untouched on the mahogany table. He picked up the $11,000 check, folded it precisely in half, and placed it in his breast pocket. "I will gather my personal belongings," Daniel said, looking down at the three of them. "You will receive my formal documentation before I leave the building." Without waiting for a dismissal, Daniel turned and walked out of the conference room. The silence he left in his wake was heavy with unspoken threats. He navigated the maze of cubicles back to his desk. The floor was quiet, most employees having already checked out mentally for the weekend. Daniel pulled a cardboard box from the supply closet and began placing his personal items inside. A framed photograph, a specialized mechanical keyboard, a customized coffee mug. As he packed, his eyes flicked to his monitor. The Federal Compliance Gateway was still running, its complex algorithms chewing through encrypted data streams. It was a system that required constant supervision, a system that Julian had mandated for federal contract compliance, but had never bothered to understand. Daniel knew something they did not. The gateway was hard-coded with a 21-day transition protocol. If an authorized administrator did not log in and authenticate the handover sequence within that time frame, the system would lock down to prevent data breaches. It would freeze all outgoing federal compliance reports, effectively halting Ascent Systems' ability to bid on or fulfill lucrative government contracts. They wanted him gone in 43 minutes. They had no idea they'd just initiated a countdown that only he could stop. Daniel finished packing his box, a profound sense of gritty satisfaction replacing the initial sting of the ambush. He opened a blank text document, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard as he drafted his conditional resignation, meticulously citing the law they had violated. He was leaving, but the foundation he built would remember him. The air at Red Rocks was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and ancient dust. Daniel breathed it in, letting the high-altitude chill fill his lungs. It was Saturday morning, barely past dawn, and the rust-colored monoliths rose around him like silent sentinels. For the first time in 14 years, his phone was not tethered to his palm. It sat deep in his canvas backpack, powered on but silenced. He had hiked 3 miles up the trail, finding a secluded outcrop that overlooked the sprawling valley below. The silence was absolute, a profound contrast to the hum of servers and the frantic chatter of the operations floor that had defined his existence for over a decade. Down in the city, Bradley was likely pacing the sleek corridors of Apex Solutions, his expensive shoes echoing against the polished concrete. Daniel could picture it perfectly. The transition team, led by a 26-year-old junior executive named Oliver, would be realizing the catastrophic depth of their ignorance. Oliver possessed 2 elite degrees and 0 practical experience with legacy infrastructure. He spoke in buzzwords, throwing around terms like synergy and optimization, fundamentally misunderstanding the delicate, tangled architecture of the Federal Compliance Gateway. Daniel had built that gateway from scratch, layering custom security protocols over outdated government mainframes to keep the data flowing securely. It was a beast only he fully understood. Throughout Saturday and Sunday, Daniel hiked. He covered 15 miles of rough terrain, his leg muscles burning with a satisfying ache. Whenever he paused to drink water, he would briefly check his screen. The notifications piled up like a slow-motion avalanche. 7 missed calls from Bradley, 12 from Oliver, frantic texts asking for the decryption keys to the secondary routing tables, voicemails pleading for a quick 5-minute consultation. Daniel deleted the voicemails without listening to them. He watched a hawk circle, the thermals high above the canyon, feeling a profound sense of detachment. He had given them the handover documentation. He had explicitly outlined the 21-day transition protocol. They had laughed at his timeline, called it a dinosaur approach, and escorted him out of the building. The consequences were no longer his concern. Monday morning broke with heavy rain in the city, but Daniel was safely inside his cabin, brewing a strong cup of dark roast coffee. He sat in his leather armchair, a thick paperback resting on his lap. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the corporate bloodbath began. The Federal Compliance Gateway, deprived of its daily manual calibration and stripped of the necessary handshake certificates that Daniel updated every 48 hours, initiated a hard lockdown. It was a fail-safe mechanism he had designed to prevent unauthorized access during a breach. To the automated systems at Apex Solutions, it looked like a routine error. To the federal agencies relying on that gateway to process secure communications, it was a sudden, impenetrable wall. Government clients started experiencing rolling outages by 10 o'clock. By noon, the entire Eastern Seaboard compliance reporting network was dark. Daniel could imagine the escalating panic on the operations floor. Alarm bells would be ringing. Oliver would be sweating through his tailored shirt, desperately typing commands into a terminal that refused to recognize his administrative privileges. The 21-day protocol was not a suggestion. It was a mandatory cooling period designed to slowly transfer encryption authorities from Daniel to the cloud infrastructure. Without it, the system assumed it was under a hostile takeover. Tuesday arrived with clear skies. Daniel drove into town to buy fresh groceries. He bought a thick steak, 3 pounds of potatoes, and a bottle of heavy red wine. The cashier made small talk about the weather, completely oblivious to the digital apocalypse unfolding 50 miles away. Daniel smiled, paid in cash, and drove back to his cabin. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, his phone vibrated against the wooden kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed a name that made Daniel pause. It was Nicholas Frost, the general counsel for Apex Solutions. Frost was a ruthless corporate attorney, a man who only got involved when millions of dollars were at risk or federal regulators were breathing down the board collective neck. The fact that the top lawyer was calling meant Bradley and Oliver had failed completely, and the fallout had reached the highest levels of the organization. Daniel let it ring 4 times before answering. He brought the receiver to his ear, saying nothing. "Daniel, thank God." Nicholas Frost breathed, his voice tight with panic. "We have a massive situation here. I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I am listening, Nicholas," Daniel said, his tone perfectly level. "We are experiencing a catastrophic failure across the federal gateway," Frost continued, speaking rapidly. "The government clients are threatening breach of contract. Bradley is telling the board this is a technical misunderstanding, a glitch in your handover code. We need you to remote in immediately and lift the lockdown. We will pay your hourly consulting rate, whatever you want. Just fix it." Daniel leaned against the counter, watching a blue jay land on his deck. He felt no anger, only a cold, calculated calm. He had warned them. He had documented every step. They had chosen arrogance over competence. "There is no technical misunderstanding, Nicholas," Daniel replied slowly, enunciating every word. "The system is operating exactly as designed under the parameters of an unauthorized access attempt. The transition protocol was aborted." "Daniel, please," Frost begged, the corporate veneer cracking. "You built this. You know how to bypass the failsafe. We are bleeding millions of dollars an hour in penalties. I can have a car at your house in 30 minutes. "I am not at my house, Nicholas," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a smooth, quiet rumble, "and I am not available for consulting. As Human Resources so efficiently reminded me on Friday afternoon, I am currently on paid time off for the next 3 weeks, before my official termination date. I suggest you tell Bradley to figure it out." Daniel hung up the phone. He powered the device down completely, tossing it into the bowl by the door. He walked back into the kitchen, picked up his heavy chef knife, and began prepping his steak. The weekend was over, but his peace of mind was just beginning. The digital chime of the virtual meeting room echoed through Daniel's home office. He sat perfectly still, staring into his webcam. On his monitor, 3 separate video boxes appeared. First was Marshall, his attorney, looking sharp in a tailored suit. Next came Nicholas Frost, the general counsel, his face fixed in a mask of manufactured patience. Finally, Julian logged on. The chief financial officer looked terrible. Heavy bags dragged beneath his eyes, and his skin carried the pale sheen of a man who had not slept in a week. "Gentlemen," Nicholas began, his tone dripping with forced civility, "we are here to discuss Daniel's sudden departure and reach a mutually beneficial resolution." Marshall did not let him finish. "Let us skip the corporate theater," Marshall said. "My client did not depart. He was constructively terminated in an illegal manner. You stripped him of his duties, locked him out of mission-critical systems, and effectively breached his executive agreement, and you did it in a way that violates the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act." Nicholas stiffened. "Now, Marshall, let us not throw around accusations of statutory violations. Daniel's role was merely being restructured. There was no termination. "Do not insult my intelligence," Marshall snapped back. "You replaced a man with 3 decades of logistics experience with a kid who barely knows how to format a spreadsheet. You did this specifically because of Daniel's age and salary, attempting to force a resignation to avoid paying his severance. The legal precedents are overwhelmingly in our favor. We have documented every email, system lockout, and directive issued by Julian. We are prepared to take this to court, drag your executive suite through grueling depositions, and make your communications public record." Julian's face flushed crimson. "This is completely absurd," he sputtered, leaning close to his microphone. "He walked away when we needed his leadership the most. He abandoned his post. He was locked out of the enterprise software on a Monday morning without notice," Marshall corrected him. "You breached the terms of the executive agreement. My client is legally entitled to his full severance package, the immediate vestment of his stock options, and compensatory damages for the blatant age discrimination." Daniel remained silent, his expression an impenetrable mask. He knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. Bradley, the wonderkind they had installed to replace him, was having a meltdown. The Department of Transportation portal, the central nervous system for their interstate trucking fleet, was unstable. The mandatory compliance updates were failing to synchronize. Because of this, dozens of trucks were sitting idle at way stations, accumulating massive fines. Contract penalties with their biggest clients were triggering left and right. The company was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars every day. Daniel knew the fragile legacy code. Bradley did not have a clue. "So, what exactly is the demand, Marshall?" Nicholas asked. He sounded entirely beaten. "The demand is simple and strictly non-negotiable," Marshall stated clearly. $1.7 million, paid in a single lump sum within 10 business days. In exchange, my client signs a non-disclosure agreement, a release of all claims, and walks away quietly. You avoid a devastating lawsuit, and you can try to save your sinking ship." Julian slammed his fist on his desk. $1.7 million? Are you out of your mind? That is blatant extortion. We will not pay a dime. We will bury you in litigation." Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm and steady. It cut through Julian's panic like a razor. "Julian," Daniel said softly, "you are currently incurring contract penalties of roughly $80,000 a day because the Department of Transportation protocol is failing. Your young prodigy, Bradley, is in a state of sheer panic because he cannot force the legacy handshake protocol to accept the mandated security certificates. By Friday afternoon, those penalties will trigger breach of contract clauses with your 3 largest retail partners. By next Wednesday, you will be facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis that will require you to draw down your emergency credit facility at a punishing interest rate." Julian froze entirely. The color drained from his face. Nicholas stared blankly at Daniel, his eyes wide with sudden realization. "You are losing money significantly faster than you can print it," Daniel continued smoothly. "You do not have the time, financial resources, or operational stability to fight a protracted legal battle against me. A lawsuit will trigger an emergency audit from the board of directors. When the board sees the emails unequivocally proving you orchestrated my illegal removal simply to cover up your own budgetary failures, they will not just fire you, they will ruin you." The silence in the virtual room was absolute. Marshall sat back comfortably in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had done the heavy lifting, but Daniel had driven the final nail into the corporate coffin. "This is not extortion, Julian," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a cold register. "This is simply the cost of doing business with dangerous amateurs. You tried to cut corners to save money. You tried to throw me away to save your own fragile skin. You miscalculated on a monumental scale. Now you are going to pay the bill. $1.7 million is a bargain compared to what will happen if you drag this out. I think your board of directors would agree." Nicholas cleared his throat nervously, his professional demeanor shattered. "We will need to take this demand directly to the executive committee," he said quietly. "We will need 48 hours to review the demand and consult with the board." "You have exactly 24 hours, Marshall replied smoothly. "By this time tomorrow morning, the offer expires completely, and we immediately filed a suit in federal court. I highly suggest you make the most of your limited time. Have a wonderful afternoon." Without waiting for a response, Marshall disconnected from the call. Daniel lingered for exactly 3 seconds, watching the absolute despair wash over Julian's pale face before he reached out and clicked the button, closing the laptop. The large room fell silent once again. Daniel stood up slowly, walked over to the tall window, and looked out over the sprawling city skyline below. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction settling into his bones. The intricate gears were turning exactly as he had meticulously planned. The trap had violently sprung shut. He walked to the kitchen to pour a fresh cup of coffee. The long waiting game was finally over. Friday morning broke gray and unforgiving, matching the atmosphere inside the glass-walled conference room of the downtown executive suites. Amanda Pierce, the chief executive officer of the parent conglomerate, had flown in on a red-eye flight from the West Coast. She did not like red-eye flights. She liked surprises even less, and the catastrophic briefing file waiting on her desk had ruined her entire quarter. She sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, her posture rigid, her expression carved from solid ice. Across from her, projected onto the massive wall monitor, were Nicholas Frost, the lead corporate counsel, and Arthur Vance, a senior member of the audit committee. Neither man looked rested. They had been awake since Thursday night, desperately trying to construct a legal defense where absolutely none existed. Daniel sat on the other side of the mahogany table, directly opposite Amanda. He wore his best tailored suit, projecting absolute calm and unshakable confidence. He had all the leverage, and every single person in the room knew it. Amanda folded her hands together. She demanded to know how a highly profitable regional branch had devolved into a massive legal and financial liability in the span of a few short weeks. Daniel opened his leather portfolio and outlined the structural failures, the undocumented policy shifts, and the blatant violations of employment law orchestrated by Bradley. He detailed the unencrypted data transfers, the hostile work environment, and the undeniable paper trail of retaliation against whistleblowers. He spoke for 15 minutes without interruption. His tone was measured and completely devastating. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the current regional administration. Amanda listened in absolute silence, her eyes narrowing as the sheer magnitude of the exposure became clear. This was not a minor human resources dispute. This was a systemic failure that threatened to draw federal regulators into their corporate ecosystem. The compliance fines alone could wipe out their annual dividend. The civil lawsuits would bleed their legal budget dry for years to come. Arthur Vance rubbed his temples on the video feed. He muttered that the compliance violations were entirely indefensible. Nicholas Frost remained silent, staring at the screen with the grim realization of a lawyer who knew a losing hand when he saw one. Amanda shifted her icy gaze from the monitor back to Daniel. She did not bother to defend Bradley. She possessed zero loyalty to incompetence. Bradley had been her appointment, a calculated risk to drive profit margins higher, but he had become an unmanageable liability. In her corporate world, liabilities were excised with surgical precision and zero remorse. She asked Daniel directly what it would take to seal the breach. She wanted a final number and a framework to make the problem disappear completely before the stock market closed for the weekend. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He laid out the terms with the same dispassionate precision Amanda used. First, the financial compensation. $1.7 million as a primary settlement for his client, fully indemnified and tax-protected. Second, complete coverage of all outstanding legal fees incurred during the entirety of the dispute. Third, a neutral reference letter, standard corporate template, barring any negative disparagement from the company or any of its subsidiaries in perpetuity. Nicholas Frost balked on the video screen. He called the financial demand extortionate and unprecedented. He argued fiercely that they could litigate the matter for half that amount and drag it out for a decade. Daniel turned his attention slowly to the screen. He reminded Nicholas of the exact discovery process that would occur if a public lawsuit were filed. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of federal subpoenas tearing through their internal servers, uncovering every hasty email and bypassed security protocol Bradley had authorized in his pursuit of higher margins. He asked Nicholas calmly if he wanted to explain those emails to a federal judge in a sworn deposition. Nicholas closed his mouth tightly and looked away, his face pale. Amanda did not flinch at the monetary figure. To a conglomerate of their massive size, $1.7 million was a rounding error compared to the existential threat of regulatory audits and collapsed share prices. But she knew Daniel had one more card to play. Daniel delivered the final strike. He stated that the financial settlement only resolved past grievances. To prevent the branch from imploding completely and triggering further action, the leadership vacuum had to be addressed immediately. Bradley had to be stripped of all operational authority by the close of business today. Amanda raised a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She asked who Daniel suggested should run the branch while they conducted a national executive search. Daniel named Rebecca Nolan. The name hung in the quiet air of the conference room. Rebecca was a 20-year veteran of the company, a woman who knew the internal systems flawlessly, and the exact person Bradley had placed on the chopping block to artificially inflate his quarterly margins. She was fiercely loyal to the staff, highly competent, and widely respected across every department. Reinstating her and elevating her to interim director would instantly stabilize the terrified workforce and restore operational integrity without missing a single step. Amanda stared at Daniel for a long time. She recognized the sheer elegance of the move. Daniel was not just extracting a massive financial payout. He was restructuring the local power dynamic to ensure his client and his allies were protected long after he walked out of the building. It was ruthless, efficient, and undeniably the best option available to stop the bleeding. Arthur Vance nodded slowly on the screen, voicing his immediate approval of Rebecca. Nicholas Frost remained conspicuously quiet. Amanda unclasped her hands and rested them flat on the smooth mahogany table. She looked at Daniel with professional respect. She told him that Bradley would be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a formal internal investigation, which was standard corporate terminology for a quiet, unceremonious termination. He would never set foot in the building again. She agreed to the immediate appointment of Rebecca Nolan as interim branch director, effective Monday morning. She agreed to the $1.7 million financial settlement without further negotiation. She agreed to the total payment of all legal fees and the issuance of the neutral reference letter. She demanded that the non-disclosure agreements be ironclad, completely airtight, and signed by all parties by 5 o'clock that evening. Daniel nodded once. He assured her the paperwork was already prepared and waiting for her signature in his briefcase. The video call ended with a sharp click, leaving the massive wall screen completely dark. Amanda stood up, collected her thick briefing files, and offered Daniel a curt, respectful nod. She told him he had played a very dangerous game with exceptional skill. Then she turned and walked out of the conference room, already dialing her executive assistant to begin the swift and merciless dismantling of Bradley and his career. Daniel remained in the quiet room for a moment longer, savoring the silence. He packed his leather briefcase with deliberate, measured movements. The job was done. The settlement was secured. The tyrant had been permanently overthrown, and the loyalists had been restored to their rightful power. It was exactly the kind of Friday morning he appreciated. At 6:15 in the evening, the boardroom door closed. Daniel sat at the table, the ink on his separation agreement finally dry. Opposite him, Rebecca looked exhausted. Julian was absent, nursing a bruised ego and a compromised budget in his office. Daniel produced a small steel flash drive containing the transition credentials. He slid it across the table, halting it perfectly in front of Rebecca. "You have everything you need," Daniel said calmly. "The migration protocols are documented and fail-safes are active. The system will hold if your team follows the sequential unlock procedure. Do not let them rush it." Rebecca picked up the drive, her fingers brushing the cold metal. "Thank you, Daniel. I know this was not the transition any of us wanted. It was the transition the company chose," Daniel replied, rising. He buttoned his jacket, feeling profound closure. He had protected his legacy and dictated his exit. He walked out into the crisp evening air, not looking back. 6 months passed quietly. Daniel spent the time decompressing, far removed from server crashes and quarterly targets. His negotiated severance allowed him total freedom. He became a regular at an upscale cafe tucked in a cobblestone alley on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 6 months after his departure. Oliver walked through the cafe doors. The young executive looked entirely different. His arrogant edge was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted expression. Oliver spotted Daniel and hesitated, then walked over, pulling out the chair opposite him. "Do you mind?" he asked, his voice subdued. Daniel gestured for him to sit. "Not at all, Oliver. You look like you need a strong coffee." "I need a stiff drink, but coffee will have to do," Oliver muttered, signaling the waiter. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain drumming softly against the large glass window. "It has been a rough few months," Oliver finally admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic mug the waiter brought. "The migration was a nightmare. Even with your credentials, the new team barely managed to keep the infrastructure from collapsing. We had 3 major outages in the first month. The board was furious. I told Julian the system required institutional knowledge, not just raw processing power," Daniel said calmly, taking a sip of his espresso. Oliver let out a hollow laugh. "Julian is gone, resigned last week. The board launched a full internal audit after the outages. They discovered he had been manipulating the quarterly projections to make the restructuring look more profitable than it actually was. When the real costs of the downtime hit the ledger, they forced him out." "And Bradley?" Daniel asked, feeling a faint, grim satisfaction at the mention of the cutthroat efficiency expert. "Fired," Oliver said bluntly. The moment the board realized the aggressive cost-cutting was destroying the core product, they made him the scapegoat. Security escorted him out without severance. Daniel looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets. It was a classic corporate implosion, entirely predictable and completely avoidable. They had mistaken age for obsolescence, and in doing so, they had gutted the very foundation that held the company together. "You tried to warn us," Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did not see it then. I just saw the bottom line and the pressure to innovate. I did not realize that true innovation requires a stable foundation. We treated you like a liability." "You treated me like a line item," Daniel corrected him, his tone firm but not unkind. "You forgot that behind every line item is a person, a history, and a body of knowledge that cannot be replicated by a fresh graduate with a textbook understanding of management theories." "You learned a very expensive lesson, Oliver. The true cost of disrespect is always higher than the cost of retention." Oliver nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words. "What are you doing now, Daniel?" "With all your experience, you could write your own ticket anywhere." "I am consulting," Daniel said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But not the kind you might think. I have been working with older professionals in the tech sector, men and women who are facing the exact same pressures I did. I help them understand their rights, specifically under the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act. I teach them how to negotiate, how to leverage their institutional knowledge, and how to ensure they are not pushed out the door with a fraction of what they deserve." "You are helping them fight back," Oliver observed. "I am helping them level the playing field," Daniel replied. "The industry has a dangerous obsession with youth, a blind spot that equates energy with competence. I am making sure that those who built the industry are compensated fairly when the new guard decides it is time for a change. It is deeply rewarding work." Oliver finished his coffee and stood up. "I should get back. We are still cleaning up the mess. But I am glad I ran into you, Daniel. I really am." "Take care of yourself, Oliver," Daniel said. "And remember, the foundation is everything." Daniel watched the young man walk out into the rain, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He finished his espresso and opened his notebook. He had a meeting later that afternoon with a senior systems architect facing a hostile restructuring, and he needed to outline the negotiation strategy. He felt a profound sense of purpose, a deep satisfaction that transcended the simple victory he had won 6 months prior. He had learned that respect was not something given freely in the modern corporate arena. It was something demanded, negotiated, and legally enforced. Value was not determined by age, but by capability, resilience, and the quiet, unwavering power of experience. He had forced them to acknowledge his worth, and in doing so, he had forged a new path, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. The system would always try to discard the old in favor of the new, but Daniel knew the truth. The architects of the past hold the blueprints for the future, and their price is never cheap.